Hello, friends. Do you want to get into music, but you're not sure what the squiggly lines all over the page mean? Well, you come to the right place. Chris from doWhileLoops here. And by the end of this video, you're going to be up and running with all the knowledge that you need to get started making some music and having some fun. With that, let's buckle up and get to it. Alright, so generally speaking, music can be thought of as the interplay between two main concepts, rhythm and harmony. Rhythm can be defined as when and for how long notes are to be played, and harmony can be thought of as which notes are to be played. And the entire goal of written music is to communicate these concepts to the player in a standardized way that everyone understands. Now, to illustrate the difference between rhythm and harmony, let's take a listen to the old classic Happy Birthday to You. So let's first take a listen with the same rhythm and harmony that we're all used to. Now let's listen with the same harmony, but different rhythm. Amazing. And finally, with the same rhythm, but different harmony. Breathtaking. We'll be taking a look at these two concepts separately, starting with rhythm, but first things first, let's take a look at the staff. Alright, so music is written on what's called a staff, which is 5 horizontal lines, leaving 4 spaces between them. Now there are various things that also go on the staff to determine different things that happen with the rhythm and the harmony, but for starters, we're just dealing with 5 lines and 4 spaces. Okay, so let's talk about rhythm. Recall that rhythm can be defined as when and for how long notes are to be played. Now the starting point of rhythm is the beat, which is the basic unit of time in the song. With a lot of music, this will be where your foot will naturally want to tap along. Now these beats are divided up into repeated sequences, which are called measures. And the thing that determines how many beats and how they're divided in each measure is called a time signature, which is written here. Now there are many time signatures, but by far the most widely used is called 4/4. So let's take a look at that as our example. Now here's how to decode a time signature. The top number means how many beats are in each measure, and the bottom number tells you what note signifies or, quote, gets the beat. And in 4/4, this means that there are 4 beats to a measure, and what's called a quarter note signifies a single beat. A quarter note looks like this. And since there are 4 of these to every measure, 4 measures of quarter notes would look and sound like this. Now there are a few other rhythm notations we should know as well. For example, here are 4 measures of half notes, which are worth 2 quarter notes each. Great. Let's take a look and a listen at the first 4 measures of Twinkle Twinkle Little Star to get a glimpse of all this in action. So the other rhythm notations you should be aware of are the whole note, which is worth 4 quarter notes, the 8th note, which is worth half of 1 quarter note, and the 16th note, which is worth a quarter of a quarter note. And here's an example of 1 measure each of all of these values. It's also important to note that although we'll be using single notes in most of our examples, In actual music, multiple notes can and will be played at the same time. Here's an example of what that would look and sound like. Boy, that's great stuff. But music is generally not a constant stream of noise. There's usually some spaces and pauses in there. To signify the absence of any note, we use what are called rests. Now, these are just like the notation for the notes that you're actually playing. You have the quarter rest, the half rest, etc. The only difference is instead of playing a note, you rest. So here's the same example as before, except in each measure, the notes have been interspersed with rests of the same values. Okay, so far so good. We have rhythm and rests. There's one more thing we should cover before we move on, the dot. So a dot can be applied to a note or a rest and will add half of its length to it. For example, a dotted half note will last a total of 3 beats instead of its usual 2, and a dotted quarter note will last 1.5 beats instead of its usual 1. Take a look at the next example. Here we have a dotted quarter note combined with an eighth note, adding up to a total of 2 beats. And we also have a dotted quarter rest with an eighth note filling out the rest of the beat. And it sounds a little something like this. There we go. Rhythm, rests, and dots. That's all you really need to know to get going on the rhythm side of the house. Now let's move over to harmony and break it down. Alright, harmony. So the first thing to talk about with harmony is the musical alphabet, which is nothing more than the letters A through G. And the important thing to remember is that this sequence repeats infinitely, so once we get to G, we just start over again at A. And also, we can start and end on any note. For example, here are examples of the alphabet starting on C and E. On our staff, every line in space will correspond to a letter in the musical alphabet. However, we have to have a way of signifying which notes go on which lines, and this is done through use of a clef. There are many clefs, but let's take a look at the treble clef first, which looks like this. Now note that the treble clef winds around the second line of the staff here. The note on that line is a G note. And now that we know that, the rest of the notes in the staff will look like this. This seems like a lot to remember, but there are a few things that can help. Most importantly, there are mnemonic devices. The lines on the treble clef are E, G, B, D, F. So you can use Every Good Boy Does Fine, Even George Bush Drives Fast, or just make up your own. And for the spaces, it just spells face. I mean, you can obviously make up your own device, but for a lot of people, it's just easier to remember face. Now, this is all great, but what about when we need to play notes that are not on the staff? And for that, we use what are called ledger lines. Let's take a look at a larger scale on the treble clef starting from middle C. Now, this C is called middle C, and it sits on a ledger line like this. You can see that a ledger line is basically like a temporary line on the staff for when we run out of actual lines on the staff. The same goes for above the staff. You can see A sits on a ledger line like this, B sits right above it, and C sits on 2 ledger lines. So another way to remember the names of the notes in any given clef are through the use of landmark notes. These are basically like signposts. The idea is that if you remember these notes first, then you can use them to calculate your way to the rest of the notes until you actually get the staff memorized. And for the treble clef, these landmark notes are usually G, C, and C. So that is the treble clef. Alright, so let's take a look at another commonly used clef in music, the bass clef. So the concept is the same as the treble clef, but the 2 dots in the bass clef here surround the note F. When you know that, the rest of the notes in the bass clef look like this. The lines in the spaces for the bass clef are G, B, D, F, A, and A, C, E, G. A couple of good ideas to remember these are good boys do find always, and all cows eat grass. But again, feel free to make up your own. Okay, great. Now, if you're a piano player, you're probably going to be using music that has two staffs, one with the treble clef and one with the bass clef. And that is called the grand staff. Let's check it out. Okay, so the grand staff looks like you would expect. And generally speaking, your left hand will be playing the notes in the bass clef, and your right hand will be playing the notes in the treble clef. And here's a 4-octave C scale which stretches across the grand staff. Note that each staff can contain notes that can be written on the other through the use of ledger lines. And this C here, or middle C, is thought to be the crossover between the two. Okay, so that was a lot of information. Let's take a pause here and return to our Twinkle Twinkle Little Star example written in both clefs and see all this in action. Now here are all three examples. Notice we have our time signature and our clefs here. Here it is in the treble clef, which we saw earlier. And here we are in the bass clef. And here we are in the grand staff, playing in octaves. Okay, so let's talk about sharps and flats. In a nutshell, adding a sharp to a note will raise it 1/2 step, while adding a flat to a note will lower it 1/2 step. In written music, these are called accidentals. Let's take a look at how these work. So sharps and flats are added in written music before the note that they are applied to. And when you see one, that note becomes raised or lowered for the rest of the measure that it occurs in. And to undo a sharp or a flat note, a natural sign is used, which returns the note to its natural state. Here's Twinkle Twinkle Little Star again, only with some sharps, flats, and natural signs thrown in. Beware, this is not your grandmother's version. And finally, there are key signatures. Now, music is organized into what are called keys. And a full discussion of keys and music theory is outside the scope of this video, but essentially, a key signature is going to tell you what notes are sharped or flatted automatically as you move through the song. Now, for example, here are the first 4 measures of Beethoven's classic Ode to Joy in the key of D major. And you can see that every F and C will be sharped as you move through the piece. Now, this same music could be rewritten with accidentals everywhere as such, but key signatures are a great shorthand for signifying this. By the way, if you want to get farther into keys, theory, or just music in general, consider subscribing to the channel where I have videos delving farther into all things music. I'll put a link to those videos in the description box, as well as a link where you can sign up for private lessons on trumpet, guitar, or basically anything musical that you want to know more about. Okay, so we covered a lot of ground thus far. We talked about rhythm and harmony and how those two concepts are presented in written music. Now let's talk about the different markings that there are and what they can tell you about how the music is supposed to be performed. So first, let's talk dynamics, which are basically how loud or soft the music is meant to be played. These are indicated by some Italian words, and here they are on the screen. This is a lot of information, but you can boil these down to 2 words, piano and forte. Piano means soft and quiet, and forte means loud and strong. Mezzo means half, so mezzo forte is halfway to forte, and the same for mezzo piano. Moving outward, we see the suffix issimo, which means very. So fortissimo and pianissimo mean very forte and very piano. And finally, we have fortissimo and pianissimo, which are very, very forte and very, very piano. Now, dynamics can be marked by themselves in the music, but we can also ramp up and ramp down into them from other dynamic levels. The way we do that is by adding a crescendo or a decrescendo. Crescendo means to get louder to a certain dynamic level, and decrescendo means to get softer to a certain dynamic level. Take a listen to the example and you'll see what I mean. Now, tempo is another kind of marking that you'll see, and this means how fast or slow the music is meant to be played. Tempo is usually measured in beats per minute, or BPM for short. For example, 60 BPM is literally 1 beat a second, and sounds like this. A 120 BPM is twice as fast, 2 beats a second, sounds like this. Tempo can be expressed using exact tempo markings as such, or there are other Italian words that are used to give a broader, more feel-based indication for the tempo. Here's an example of some of the most popular ones. And just to drive this home, here's an example of Twinkle Twinkle Little Star with an exact tempo marking of 80 beats per minute. And here's an example of a presto tempo. Okay, so let's talk articulation. Articulation is a big one, and this is basically how to play each note or group of notes. If you think about it, when I speak, I can speak in short little words, or I can draw the words out. Music is no different, and this is where articulation markings come in. Now, first off, we have staccato and tenuto. These two are opposite each other. Staccato means to play the note short and detached from the others, and tenuto means to sustain the note for its full value. Closely related to tenuto are slur markings, which are generally used for wind, string, or voice music, and mean to play each group of notes as smooth as possible without any articulation between them. There are also accents, which indicate an emphasis on the beginning of the note. Let's take a look at Ode to Joy again using these different articulations. We use the trumpet as an example to get the feel of each one. And finally, we have signs that have to do with the structure or the overall roadmap of the music itself. Now, basically, a lot of music has repeated sections to it. A good example of this is like a pop song that has a repeated chorus. And in order to get around writing the same music out over and over again, a few common signs are used. So first off, we have repeat signs, which bookend a section of music. When you see these, repeat that section once. Here's Old MacDonald Had a Farm, written with repeat sections. So how about when music is mostly repeated, but has a different ending each time? And there are a couple of different ways we can express this. Let's use Ode to Joy again as an example. Here it is fully written out. You can see all the measures are identical, except for measure 8 here. This piece could be rewritten using what are called first and second endings like this. And when you see this, play the piece straight through and take the first ending, then go back to the beginning or a repeat sign if it exists, and play through again and take the second ending. Here's an example of how to read this. This piece could also be rewritten using what's called da capo al coda, or DC al coda for short. Da capo means the beginning, and the coda is basically a tag meant to go on the end of the piece. When you see this, play the piece straight through, and then go to the beginning, play till the coda sign, and then jump immediately to the coda and play it. Here's the example of how to read this. And finally, closely related to DC all codas are DS all codas. DS stands for da segno, or the sign. These function identically to DC all codas, except for you go back to the sign on the repeat instead of the beginning. Here's an example using Ode to Joy. This example doesn't make much musical sense to play, but you can see the idea. So there you have it, friends, how to read music in a nutshell. One final pro tip though, and that's that written music only really exists so you can get it off the page and through your instrument and out into the actual world. And your job as a musician is to not get too hung up on the reading of it, but to focus on the actual playing of it. So take that one for what it's worth. Anyway, I thank you for watching. Please subscribe to the channel to see more videos like this one in the future. Let me know down in the comments if there's any other subjects that you'd like to see covered. Chris from doWhileLoops here. Take it easy and enjoy making music.